Hello everybody, welcome to our first FAB Foundations video. This is a video series that Zach and I wanted to put together just to essentially be a bridge between those kind of beginner moments where like you know how to operate the rules of Flesh and Blood, you know how to build a basic deck, you've walked through the basic steps, but you're not quite ready for like here's the Calling Champion 5 sideboard cards that won me the game video, you know?
So you mean that's basically for most of us?
Yeah,
right there in the middle, which is we know how to play, we just don't know how to play super well.
Exactly. There's a gulf kind of there in the middle, and I think a lot of content skews towards brand new people, like here's the rules, and then towards very expert players, kind of sharing their perspective on things. So we're trying to be right here in the middle, and we want to kind of take you along with us to start flirting with being actually quite good at the game, which Zach and I have been flirting with the idea of being really good at this game for many months now.
Still a great aspiration of mine someday in the long future. And I think the reality is when we started breaking down, we've been playing the game for about a year now. So if you're watching this many years from now, this could be quite funny. But the reality is that we started breaking down the topics we maybe wanted to cover throughout this entire series. And ultimately, I also taught some people recently how to play. Like for the first time in a while, I taught brand new people. And watching them interact with the game again, there was all these things, just going on in my brain where it's like, and I'm very keen on the idea of letting people learn themselves,
sure,
right? But the reality is there's so much nuance to what is ultimately a pretty simple rule set. Because they got the basics of how to navigate a turn and stuff pretty quickly. But then they started having those revelations that we had throughout that first year of time.
Yeah.
A simple example was like that moment that I think all of us have where it's like, wait a second, the more I block, the weaker my turn is, right?
Yeah.
Also, the more damage I do, the weaker my opponent's next turn is, assuming they block. And that is kind of, one of the big things about the game. But there's so much here, and, we finally, I think, found a good place to start. You got to start somewhere.
It starts where all card games have to start. I mean, we have to talk about what's the value of a card here.
So sometimes thousands of dollars. Tens of thousands of dollars.
So Zach and I have got our coffee here. We're just going to hang out for a second. Hopefully this won't go too long, and we're going to talk this over. And these are the concepts kind of that we've been tumbling with ourselves. So just to set this up, as the philosophers out there want to do, we have to start with a basic principle. Just as you said earlier, to anchor, before the video started, you said we need to anchor this to some kind of understanding. So we're going to make an assumption. And our assumption here, and I think it's a good assumption to make, is that every card is worth about 3 damage points. So it could be blocking 3, or it could be doing 3 damage. But that the sum total of what a card is contributing to your game state is 3, right? So you'll notice that most of your kind of class cards in your primary card pool does in fact block for 3, unless you're playing Azalea, and I'm sorry. But most of those cards are going to block for 3. You'll also notice that I think the template of a Flesh and Blood attack, and I don't know if this is true, so if you're out there and I'm wrong about this, didn't come out till Crucible, I would later find out. Brutal Assault. Brutal Assault is the card. So this is to me the quintessential card. If you're looking at attacks, you need to start with Brutal Assault as the idea of what an attack is doing.
Okay, so this seems like on the surface, right? If you're looking at, I'm looking at Brutal Assault, I'm really curious what you're about to say.
Yeah.
Why do you think this is, and I don't know that it was this specific card, but I do think, just like we said, we need to anchor it to something. The designers of the game probably started with a card.
Yes.
That had, because one of the notable things about this game is there's a value basically in every corner of each card. And I think it looks something like this.
I think it's pretty close to this.
It may have been a 0 cost for 3 damage that blocks for 3. Mm-hmm. That's a red. That to me, that could be a very baseline, this is what this card does. Although I don't think that card exists.
It's weirdly, I don't think it does either. I think all the 0/3s block for 2.
Yeah.
In fact.
So we'll get into that. Anyways, go ahead.
So it's a 2. So here's why I say this. So it's in the middle of the cost curve.
Okay.
3 is the most you'll pay for a card. 1 is the least you'll pay. Technically 0, but you're not paying anything for 0. It's like, do you pay anything if something's free? It's like, that's kind of the point of free. So it's between 1 and 3. The number 2, a classic number.
Perfect.
So it's right in the middle there. It also is a 6 down the line.
6 attack.
A 6 attack. So if you pitch a card to pay that 2 cost, you do a 6 attack. Your average of those 2 cards that you just put into this moment is 3 apiece.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you said the every card is worth 3. And so on the surface, you look at Brutal Assault and you say, well, that does 6. That's got to be worth more than 3. But to play Brutal Assault, you inevitably have to have a different card.
You have to have one other card to actually play it. Now, barring equipment and those kinds of things will skew the equation. But you pitch a card, you play a card. Those 2 cards average across 6 damage is 3 damage points apiece on those cards.
Sure. Okay.
It also blocks for 3. So this is in every way the kind of fundamental math of what we've seen throughout the entire game of playing it for a while now. This is about the average of every one of these values that you would expect to see.
Okay. And so, if you had a handful of Brutal Assaults and I had a handful of Brutal Assaults,
we'd be so good at the game. Yeah, we would unstoppable.
How did this happen?
Let's go win a tournament.
But the reality is, so let's say that I swing for 6 for this card.
Yeah.
Right. So then that's why that 3 defense is pretty important, just as an anchor to the entire conversation. Because if you don't block anything, you take 6 damage.
Sure.
Mission accomplished on my side. I spent 2 cards. I did 6 damage.
That's right.
The game can't ask more of me.
Although it's worth noting, and this is fundamentally true, and a lot of games have this reality, the only damage that matters is the last one. Right?
That's true.
So aside from that...
It's like a net run, all those credits you don't spend by the end of the game. It's like, I was inefficient. I had too many credits. Anyway, so presumably, though, if you assume, again, this is an assumption we're going to make, which kind of underpins the entire conversation, and there are going to be cards that constantly question these assumptions. That's the whole idea of the game, right? And finding the cards that are more or less efficient based on that stuff that's how you evaluate and you deck build and synergy and all that. But the reality is, assuming every card blocks for 3, I play a card and I pitch a resource. You use 2 cards from your hand.
2/3 blocks.
Right, to block my
attack entirely.
So now the exchanges actually happen. This is where you get into a different layer of evaluation.
Yeah.
I actually spent a card to attack, but I pitched the other. So the pitch is going to go to the bottom of my deck. Whereas you had to block with 2 cards. And when you block, those go away permanently.
Yeah.
So in that exchange, now we flip around going into your turn. You still have 2 cards left. So assuming every card has the same value curve going on, you could swing a 6 right back at me.
Right? I could pitch, play a Brutal Assault back at you.
Then I have a
choice,
2 cards. Right? Yeah. I block with 2. And if I block with 2, you've spent 1 card, I've spent 2. No damage has been taken, and I have a 2-card hand.
And we could do that forever.
And if we did do that forever, it would probably, the winner would be whoever had the better weapon.
Yeah, of course.
At the very end.
But I think the important thing to notice there, just in that first exchange, just think about that first exchange. It looks like if I pitch a card, play a Brutal Assault, you block with 2 3s. It looks like nothing has happened during that exchange, right? And you say no damage has been done, nothing. The board state hasn't changed at all. But in fact, you have lost 2 cards to my 1 in that exchange. And that's a tremendous level of efficiency that over the course of the game, if, let's just assume, that keeps happening, and you lose 2, I lose 1, you lose 2, I lose 1, you lose 2, I lose... Towards the end of that game, I have 30 cards left in my deck.
Yeah.
You have none,
and
right?
You can't block, you can't attack when you don't have cards. So presuming you get to that state and you haven't taken any damage, that's a good position to find yourself.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I think this is the key realization that you start with that is very hard to see up front, is that you start to ask the question, what happens if I just block every time with everything that I have? So there's a couple answers to that. One is, what if they do more than 12 damage? And there are ways that can happen. So that's not always possible. Yeah. But the other one is, if they're spending even 3 cards, if they're discard pump, play, and then you're blocking with 4 cards, you can do that for 15 turns. Yeah. And then your cards are gone, and then you can't block anything, and you're going to lose that game. So it's not just about how much damage did I get through, or did I get 2 into their 1. It's also about how many total cards were used in the exchanges that you're going back and forth on. Because you can be ahead on damage and then run out of deck.
Sure.
So one of the fundamental things is, when you're evaluating a card and even a play, is not just what's the efficiency of the damage on the card for how much I'm paying for it, but what does it cost me or lose me in terms of overall number of cards in my deck.
Yeah, and I think because the win condition is just doing damage, it's really easy to get really focused on how much damage you're doing. And I think the like underground score of the game is what's your card efficiency, right?
We call that the New Zealand score.
That's right. Yeah. The people that actually know how to play the game.
That's the New Zealand score.
I think I want to show a couple examples here. The first one to me is Raging Onslaught. So the reason this is relevant to this very topic is you'll notice a few things, right? If we just directly compare, it's still got the 3 defense.
Yep.
It costs 3, So
Costs one more.
costs you an extra resource. In exchange for that resource, you get a 7 damage attack on the lower left corner. So that extra resource, assuming you have blues in your deck that you can actually play this card with. When we're talking about card efficiency, this is obviously costing you more resources, but it might not actually cost you more cards out of your hand.
That's the thing, right?
Yeah.
It's still 2 cards for 7 damage.
Yeah.
The Brutal Assault, 2 cards for 6 damage.
That's right. And in Raging's case, at a 7, that's a particularly important number.
It's nice.
Because if you're doing 7, and we, again, assume every card only blocks for 3, even though there's cards that block for 2, cards that block for 4, cards that block for a lot. If every card on average blocks for 3, this means that in order for your opponent to take no damage now, suddenly, they're going to have to use a 3rd card.
They lose 3 cards to your 1.
Which is a massive exchange in terms of how much of your deck is left. But then also, it means that going into their turn, they only have 1 card left.
Right.
And the things you can do, and there's a whole topic on that, like the sequence of how many cards you're making your opponent use.
And basically blocking and how we do all that. And we're going to dive into that.
Yeah, but
that's
ultimately, that extra card is huge because not only are you 3-1 now,
Right.
that efficiency is great. Or you do damage.
Yeah.
Also fine.
What Raging Onslaught really demonstrates is like, yeah, we can tweak the formula of a 2-6-3, make it a 3-7-3. You're going to spend an extra resource to play this card. But if you build your deck around that, because blues are inherently more efficient as resources, if you pitch a blue to play this, you're going to have the exact same exchange as a Brutal Assault, except +1 damage.
Yep.
That's the only thing that's going to change. So that's one of the variables that you're going to see tweaked throughout the game when you're evaluating cards. The second one is really what, in a lot of ways, the game is built on hit effects. I've said this before many times.
For a long time. That
I'll
was
quote
early,
myself
early
on this one.
Yeah, quote Steven said.
Which this isn't necessarily a hit effect, but it's, any card game, when you start to get into card text, now you bring in a subjective element of what is something ultimately worth. So Wounded Bull is the same card as Raging Onslaught.
Yep.
It's a 3-7, except it loses a defense. So in that moment, it's strictly worse than Raging Onslaught. Why would I ever run this card? Well, because it has that text ability. When you play it, if you have less health than your opponent, you gain an attack. So now Wounded Bull is a 3-for-8. Raging Onslaught is a 3-for-7. Brutal Assault is a 2-for-6. So if you take that 2-6-3 equation, we're now saying, well, we'll up the resources to give 1 more damage. Okay, that's Raging Onslaught. Then we'll lower the defense to give maybe more damage on a conditional. Well, now we've tweaked that template. And then we look at Demolition Crew, which is a similar tweaking of that template. Same card as Brutal Assault. It's a 2-6, but instead of a 3-block, it's a 2-block. So we take Brutal Assault, we take 1 defense away, and we add a conditional ability and Dominate, a keyword.
Yeah, it's actually not even conditional, but it's a conditional cost.
It's a conditional cost.
So
right.
you have to reveal a card in your hand that costs 2. So this is an expensive card.
It's harder to play, but we pick up a keyword that we now have to ask, is this keyword worth the inability for this card to block as effectively as Brutal Assault?
Yeah, and interestingly,
that's the question.
Preventing your opponent from blocking with extra cards is kind of interesting.
It's a really interesting keyword.
Because
we could talk about it forever. It's actually crazy how interesting it is.
It is super.
In a lot of ways, it's worthless, and in a lot of ways, it's the most valuable thing in the game.
Yeah, because early on, I played Bravo, and he has the ability to give his attacks Dominate. That's his thing. And so it's really easy to just be like, oh, I'm going to have big attacks that I give Dominate, and I'm going to force through all this damage. But then you start valuing different things as you go.
What's the value of damage?
Yeah,
right?
and that's where, like, when you start looking beyond just health, the only health that matters is the score at the end of the game. And so then it's like, now with Bravo, a lot of times, I'll swing for 10, not Dominate, because I want you to block.
Right.
Like, I want you to empty your hand.
But then sometimes you get those hit effects, and that's what we're going to get into next. So let's look at Wounding Blow. This is an example. So in my mind, there are cards that you pay for, and these are, and you'll hear these terms, these are typically your tall cards, right? So you're going to build a deck that's going to do bigger amounts of damage in singular packets. That's a tall deck, right? Yep. If you're going to build a deck that does smaller amounts of damage in different instances, multiple instances in a turn, that's what these cards are. That's kind of the family of these cards. So Wounding Blow
is referred to as wide.
That's wide. That's right. Yeah. So this is the grandfather of the basic, discounted, easy-to-play cards. This is a zero-cost card. You can always play it.
What set was this one from?
This is Welcome to Wraith. This was like the original.
This may be the foundation.
This was like you watch those early Welcome to Wraith like tournament. Wounding Blow is everywhere.
Yeah, so surely it's a 0 for 3, right?
You would think that, wouldn't you?
Right. A 0 for 3 with 3 defense.
But in fact, it's not. It's a 0, 4 attack, 3 defense. And what we found in the game is that as attack values go up, cards actually get less efficient.
That's almost the opposite of what I would assume.
But here's why, is that you're losing 1 card to do 4 for Wounding Blow. You're losing 1 card to do 6 for Brutal Assault. Both of these cards end up in your graveyard. So in the grand scheme of deck math, this card and this card are doing the same thing, but Brutal Assault's doing it way better. You're doing 6 damage, 1 card is lost. You're doing 4 damage, 1 card is lost.
Yeah.
So the lower cost cards actually have to be a little bit more efficient in what they do. Also because most actions, most turns, you get 1 action.
Yeah.
So 1 action for 4 versus 1 action for 6, no contest, right? Yeah. So Wounding Blow also has the kind of downside of if you're going to, they're more efficient cards, but if you're going to play more than one of them, which you're going to have to do most of the time, you're going to have to find ways to get go again.
Sure.
Which is going to allow you to string them together in an individual turn. So this is a 0-4-3. This is the bread and butter, nice vanilla kind of card. Then we look at how we manipulate this card. Well, let's look at Snatch. This is just the card of the early game. The card of Welcome to Wraith, Arcane Rising, that meta, and still is such an important card. This is a 0-4-2 defense.
Okay, so we lose a defense.
We lose a defense, but we gain a hit effect. If it hits, you draw a card. Right? Okay. But if the assumption that every card is worth 3 is true, and we are going to bar the idea of I have to have go again for this value, or I have to be able to put it in my arsenal, and I couldn't have otherwise, etc. We're going to leave all that at the door. This card hitting is actually worth 7 damage points.
Because you get an extra card.
Because I draw a card that's worth 3, right? Yeah. So drawing cards and discarding cards from opponent's hand becomes exceedingly high value. You see Command and Conquer all the time. You want to know why? Because every time you hit that arsenal card, you're gaining 3 points of value in that exchange, right? So Snatch is an example of how they change the equation, add a hit effect, lower defense.
Well, and it's important, I think, to kind of highlight. Obviously, if Snatch had go again, that extra card is actually worth a lot.
Crazy.
Because if you draw a Wounding Blow as that card, now you just get an extra 4 damage on your turn.
Right.
But even not, I think our basic example earlier of, Brutal Assault, you block with 2. The ability of, let's say at some point you block with 3 cards. Right? And the only card you have left is Snatch in your hand.
Yeah.
Or in your arsenal or whatever. But now you play Snatch, and your opponent, if every card blocks for 3, either they have to spend 2 cards, so they're spending their 6 in value to stop your 4.
Which is called overblocking, and that's exactly what you want people to do.
You use 1, they use 2.
Yeah.
That's good math.
Yeah.
If they don't, let's say they just use 1. So now you spent 1, they spent 1, they take a damage. Now you get a card. Even if you can't play it, that extra card can now go to arsenal.
Yeah.
And that is like having an extra card in your hand. So that's where it's not directly 3 value immediately, but in general, you can kind of assume an extra card either direction is going to be worth 3 extra. If you have a hand of 4 cards, hitting Snatch, drawing an extra card isn't going to do that much for you, right?
And you made a mistake. Right. You didn't block enough, or you didn't build the deck.
And I mean,
enough.
maybe you have Snatch in your hand, your opponent didn't attack. Maybe your previous turn was so good they just don't attack. So there's instances where it's not, that extra card isn't worth that much. But in general, that is why that card draw is worth losing the defense over. Right?
Yeah, throughout, and that's a really, you're losing 1 point for potentially gaining 3.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of the game, is like your opponent has some control. They can lose 2 points of efficiency to block your 2 points of gain, essentially, because you lose 1 and gain 3. So like when you think about how that lever actually plays, it's pretty interesting. So then we take a card like Wounding Blow. Let's go ahead and just add a resource to it with this card Push the Point. So it's 1 cost now, which actually puts it in almost an entirely different family. Like going from 0 to 1 is an infinite amount of gain, right?
Because now you're going to have to use 2 cards.
Because now it's a 2-card card.
Yeah.
It goes down to 2 defense, so you lose 1 point there, but it has a basically +2 conditional ability on it. So this could be a 1 for 6. So now we actually look and compare this to Brutal Assault. So a 2 for 6 with 3 defense, or a 1 for 6 with 2 defense. It's conditional, it's different, very different, but the basic math is here is like 1 for 6 is better than 2 for 6.
Yep.
Strictly. Because Push the Point is always playable by any card in your hand.
Yep.
Red card can always play.
Stack of reds, you can play it.
Problem is it just has conditions. So you have to say, for my deck, this is more efficient if I can pull off these conditions in a reasonable way.
Yeah.
Can I also afford not having the defense value here? These are good questions we're going to ask during deck building. And then finally, one of my absolute favorites, Nimble Strike, is in a similar family. We're going to increase the resource value by 1. It's still a 4 attack, and it's still a 2 defense. So this looks a lot like Snatch or something, you know. It's like just a little bit more expensive.
The exact stat line of Push the Point.
You're correct. Now, it has an additional cost where you banish a card from your graveyard called Nimbleism. So you have to have played that card previously, even previously in the turn, to make this work. But if you do, it goes to 5 attack. So not as good as Push the Point. It's a 1/5/2, but it also gains Go Again. And so what's the value of Go Again? What's the value of Dominate? You know, what's the value of these abilities? That's not a clean equation, right? This is why we actually play a game rather than run a simulation to see who wins the match. So this is where the subjective assessment of the players comes in and says, is Go Again important enough for the cards that I have in my hand to chain together something that's more efficient than simply taking the 5 damage or the 6 damage of Push the Point and moving on to the next turn?
Sure.
Those are the beautiful questions we get to ask as we actually move forward and learn more about the fundamentals of the game. Now, let's look at 2 more cards while we're here, just because it really is important to the conversation. I'll start out with a card like Sink Below.
So Red Sink Below.
Red Sink Below is breaking the mold of the 3. So this card is actually a 0 for 4 defense, which is way more efficient as a blocking card. Of course, the downside, which we would all recognize from knowing it's a defense reaction, it is a 0 damage card.
Right. So you can't even think about playing this as an attack.
Can't even think about it. So you have 4 Sink Belows in hand. Your estimated damage output is 0, right? So cards that can only block efficiently, a little bit extra, but they have the downside of not being able to attack at all. And that's why they almost always, I think always, well, like Unblockable or Unmovable has weird stuff, but they almost always come with a bonus ability, because the ability to not attack with a card, the 3 damage only not going one direction, is so bad, so conditionally bad, that you have to have an additional ability to really bring this in line with what the value of any other card is doing in the game.
Yeah, and also the defense reactions get the beyond more efficient block, which they are more efficient. They gain the more flexible block because they're reactions, so you don't have to reveal that it's happening up front. And all of that comes at a steep cost of attacking, like you said. But like Sink Below has that ability to put a card on the bottom of your deck and draw a card. So you get to filter your cards
just
a little bit.
Just a nice little, I can't want to play it.
Kind of like my example earlier. If your opponent doesn't attack you and you have Snatch in your hand, unless you have a really wide deck and the ability to gain a lot of Go Again, which does exist, not that relevant of a card at that point, right? But if you block with 3 cards and Snatch is what's left, that's a great card to be sitting on.
100%.
Sink Below, same thing. If your opponent does play Command and Conquer, you can't even defensive react to it. Or more importantly, they just don't attack.
Right.
Or they attack with like a 2. And it's like, well, you don't want to waste your thing on that. But that's not a great card to just be sitting in your hand on your turn.
This card has no value if they don't attack.
Particularly like a red Sink Below, right?
Yeah. That's ultimately the trade. And then you have to say, well, if they're not attacking me, is it good enough that I can do so much with my other cards that it's worth having potentially the downside of this Sink Below sitting in my hand and doing nothing?
Yeah. Now, conversely, I think a good example here is Pummel, which we were going to hit here.
So yeah, take a look at Red Pummel here.
Red Pummel costs 2. So again, I mean, it's costing as much as your Brutal Assault cost you. It's an attack reaction, so it is more flexible.
Surely it's doing 6 damage, right?
Right. I would hope so. Target Club or Hammer gets +4. So in that case, it's just +4.
2 for 4? I mean, that's I'm playing 0 for 4 with a Wounding Blow.
It's a steep ask. I agree with you. Now, of course, if your opponent doesn't attack you and you just have a flush hand, right? Having an extra 4 on this Brutal Assault as an example or whatever the hammer is or whatever you're using, even without anything else going on, is an interesting reality.
It's not terrible.
But it's red. It's only a 2 defense. I meant to mention that. So it is a little weaker on the defensive side. It has no attack. You cannot attack with this by itself. The second ability that you can choose, though, is why you're here. Target attack action card with a cost 2 or greater gains +4, and if this hit, the defending hero discards a card. So if we even look at Brutal Assault, right? You're at 6. If the average card blocks for 3, it would be pretty reasonable for your opponent to block 2. Use 2 cards to block that damage.
Right.
And then I can basically come in after that and say, all right, well, I'm going to pay 2. So again, this card costs you 2. You have to use this card and pitch a resource.
So you're now on a 4-card hand.
So to play Brutal Assault and Pummel, unless other things are going on, that's a 4-card hand, which means either my opponent didn't attack last round, I didn't block, or I had like a sneaky card in Arsenal and I blocked with 1, and there's a lot of ways that can happen. But so +4, just on the surface, right, going from 6 to 10 as a surprise could be a problem.
Yeah, what they're trying to do is kind of value how valuable is your reaction speed in this game.
Yeah.
And you know, that's a moving target. It depends on the situation. Yeah. So that's, again, why we play Flesh and Blood. We got to figure that out.
But even just if we go back to our assumption that every card is worth 3 block, this +4 is going to do one of 2 things, right? Either, well, there are really 3 things. You're either going to do 4 damage extra, and they're going to have to discard a card. And in that example, I did 4, and I cost you a card from your hand.
That's 7 exchange, right?
If a card is a 3, then I just paid 2 for 7.
Which is, it's magic. Right? That's better than Raging Onslaught, 3 for 7.
The next option is you block with 1 extra card. And again, if we assume all cards can block for 3, we've seen one that hasn't. But let's say you take 1 damage and you discard a card.
That's horrible.
So now
Terrible.
We each spent, you spent a card, actually spent it. You still took a damage and you lost a card. So that's a great exchange for me.
Incredible.
Even on the flip side, let's say Steven was sneaky and he thought, Brutal Assault, Zach's got 2 cards in his hand still. That looks like a pummel to me. I'm going to go ahead and cover it up, right? He puts 2 extra cards in.
All 4.
The value of reaction speed is, well, now I don't have to do it.
Right.
Right? So then it can go into Arsenal.
Tuck that baby in Arsenal and wait.
Or even if you are able to cover it up after the fact, let's say you had 2-3 defense reactions, you still have to spend 2 cards to cover this up.
No matter what, you're spending cards.
Yeah, so if you spend 2, I spent 1, I pitched 1. It did cost me 2 cards. But again, you're down an extra card. So that's where you can look at a card like Pummel, and it's like, well, weirdly, 2 as a reaction is the same problem. 2 for 4 is the same problem that 2 for 6 presents, right? And that reality is kind of where you start understanding all of the pins of the value, right? There's different corners that are trying to be balanced here.
So, I mean, looking at all of this, the pummel, the sink below, how those things are kind of either high value efficiency or completely worthless. And then cards that are always worth something, but to varying degrees of offensive and defensive potential. It does all pretty much revolve around 3.
It's an important number.
I mean, 3 is the number. So just consider that when you're building your deck, when you're thinking about cards to include or not include. When you're thinking about plays in your hand, if you see all those cards as little 3s, and you say, okay, so I could do 5 with 2 cards on the offense, or I could take these 2 cards and block with 6. Perhaps blocking with 6 is the more efficient choice.
Well, and I think the other, from deck building and even just gameplay perspective, the art of the game is finding ways to make your cards worth more than 3 and finding ways to make your opponent's cards worth less. And so that's why, like, even a basic example, sink below at 4 is immediately worth more, and your opponent, assuming that it's going to cost, like when you hit with the 7, right? They're assuming it's going to cost you 3 cards to block that.
Yeah.
It might only cost you 2. So they may have to spend 3 in exchange for your 2, but it's all about figuring a way to maximize the efficiency or inefficiency of your opponent, either direction. So, and every character, every card approaches that problem in a different way.
Yeah.
But if you start there and start basically tweaking either direction, depending on which you or your opponent, that is really where things start to take off.
It's the game of Flesh and Blood. So, hey, we'll be with you throughout this series to teach a number of these kind of foundational concepts that we've picked up along the way. You know, we're
1 whole year.
We know some about the game.
Still learning. Well, I think we're all still learning. Right?
Well, it's an incredible game because, you know, it just doesn't stop going in terms of what I feel like I know or what I feel like I've gained mastery over. It just constantly gets reinvented, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I was thinking about this all wrong. All that to say, I do think that 3 is the important number, and we're happy to share more lessons, those foundational lessons we learn along the way, and we can't wait to see you there.